Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see everybody here in the Cyber Policy Center seminar series, and greetings to everybody online for joining us for a really special event that I'm particularly excited about and I've been looking forward to all fall. We have a panel with three of the authors from the Facebook papers that were published this summer. There were 4 of them, and we're going to hear an overview of each of them from each of the authors. And then we'll head into a moderated Q&A. So those of you in the room will get microphones to you, and those online, you'll send them over to us as well. And let me introduce everybody here. We have Neil Malhotra, who's also here at Stanford in the GSB. Yet another reminder of how amazing Stanford is for having folks working in this space. Pablo Barbera, who's at Meta and was able to go a different direction off of 101 today to come up to campus. Really appreciate you doing that. And my colleague in communication, Jen Pan, who you all know from last year. She showed us some of her work on authoritarian regimes. So I'm going to pass it over to the 3 panelists to do their overview, and then we'll dive into the Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having us. So we're going to share the results from the first set of 4 papers from the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study. After 2016, there are lots of questions about the role of social media in American democracy. So prior to 2020 and the 2020 elections, a partnership was formed between Meta and external academics to examine the impact of social media on the 2020 elections. And the academics decided to focus on 4 main outcomes, which are political polarization, political participation, knowledge and information, including mis and disinformation, and then democratic norms and confidence in democratic institutions. And the academics proposed experimental and observational studies in collaboration with the Meta researchers. And so there are 2 types of research that are part of this partnership. One are experimental studies that took place on Facebook and Instagram with consenting participants. And then the second are observational studies of all US adults on Facebook and Instagram. But that data is aggregated when it came to us, the academics, to protect user privacy. And I have 3 more things just to note for all these studies. They're all pre-registered. For each paper, there's a group of 2 to 4 lead academic authors with control rights, which meant that those lead authors made the final decision of what was in the paper. And then Meta publicly committed to not withholding any of the results of the research because of what was in the papers. So that's the kind of background. The 4 papers that we're going to share today, Pablo is the lead Meta author on all 4 papers. Neil and I, along with Andy Guest at Princeton, are the lead academic authors on 2 of the papers that we'll be speaking with. So I'm going to turn it over to Pablo to talk about 2 of the papers.
First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of the results of this collaboration that we've spent so much time working on. I want to start by briefly introducing 2 of the studies in this first batch of papers, both of which are related to the question of whether social media platforms generate echo chamber environments in which individuals are only exposed to sources that reinforce their existing political beliefs. The first of these studies is titled Asymmetric Ideological Segregation and Exposure to Political News on Facebook. The lead authors on the academic side are Sandra Gonzalez Bailon and David Lazar. As Jen mentioned, I'm the Meta lead author for this study. So this first study is descriptive, it's observational, and it focused specifically on the news ecosystem on Facebook. And the goal was to measure the extent to which the audiences of political news on the platform are ideologically segregated in the context of the 2020 election. So here, segregation means the extent to which conservatives only see the same political news as other conservatives on Facebook, and liberals only see news that other liberals see. And ideology here was estimated based on a user-level inference that my team at Meta developed. Okay, so what do we find in this paper? So first of all, this study offers evidence that news consumption on Facebook is highly segregated by ideology. And it is segregated at levels higher than what was found in prior research looking at online news consumption. But it's at similar levels as the ideological segregation that one would find in political conversations with friends and family. The study then goes to examine what we call the funnel of engagement, which is the process by which users on Facebook see and consume political news. So we compare all the political news that exists on the platform and that users could potentially see, the ones that they actually saw on their newsfeed, and the ones that they chose to engage with. And this analysis is helpful because it helps us understand the extent to which segregation increases as you move down this funnel. That is, to what extent engagement is more segregated than exposure, more segregated than the inventory. And what we found is that both algorithmic ranking and user choices interact in a complex way in order to get to this like final result of like high levels of segregation. There's two additional findings that I want to highlight for this study. One is the one that is in the title of the paper, so the asymmetry. So the asymmetry that we find between liberals and conservatives. And in particular, the study shows that there's a large fraction of the news ecosystem that is consumed exclusively by conservatives. And it is audience homogeneity on the right of the ideological spectrum that is driving in large part the overall levels of segregation that we observe in the context of the election. And second, this asymmetry is even more pronounced when it comes to political misinformation. So we found, just to give you a statistic from the paper, over 90% of all the misinformation stories that we were analyzing and thus were shared more than 100 times during the election. So this like, popular like viral misinformation. So over 90% of those had audiences that were more conservative than liberal. Just before moving on to the other study, the one thing I want to acknowledge about this paper is one limitation, which is this is observational and descriptive, so we cannot make causal claims about the factors that explain segregation or about the consequences that it might have for aspects such as political polarization. But the second study might speak a little bit to that question. So the second study is entitled Like-Minded Sources on Facebook Are Prevalent But Not Polarizing. This is work that was led by Brendan Nyhan, Jamie Settle, Emily Thorson, and Magdalena Wojcicka on the academic side. And this second study is related to the first one. It also examines echo chambers on Facebook, but it takes a broader perspective by looking at all the sources that people see on Facebook, not just political news. And there's two parts to this paper. So the first one is a descriptive part where we use aggregated data, as Jen said, for all roughly 200 million adult US-based Facebook users. So we aggregate the data and we measure the extent to which users are exposed to politically congenial or politically like-minded sources. So what do we find? So first of all, on average, around half of everything that people see on Facebook is from like-minded sources. In contrast, something in the order of 15% is from cross-cutting sources. So if you're liberal, that's content that would be shared by a conservative source, the other way around for conservatives. The rest are sort of this like 50%, 15% is from sources that are moderate or have mixed audiences. So this, in some ways, confirms that most of what people see is, aligned potentially with their political ideology. But at the same time, the paper also shows that extreme echo chamber patterns are relatively infrequent. There's only 20% of Facebook users that get over 75% of their exposures from like-minded sources. And in addition, another important new number in this paper that is important to contextualize some of these results is that news and politics represents a small share of what people saw on Facebook, even in the context of a contentious election, in the order of 7%. 7% of what people saw was political or was news. The second part of the study is causal in nature. We run an experiment where for a sample of participants that consented to participate in the study, we demoted content from their like-minded sources. So if you want, if people were in an echo chamber, we took them out of the echo chamber, and then we tracked their political attitudes through a multi-wave survey study that allowed us to determine what happens when there's randomly assigned group in the treatment group that saw less content from like-minded sources. Do they become less polarized? Do they become more polarized? What happens with their own platform experience? So there's a lot of results that I don't have time to get into. But the main takeaway is that despite the fact that we observed large changes on their own platform experience, these interventions did not have any detectable effects on any of the outcomes that we pre-registered. So the intervention did not affect political polarization, it did not affect positions on policy issues, or any of the political attitudes that we tested. And because we had large enough samples, we were able to have precisely estimated null effects for all of these results. So what do we learn from this study? First, these results, although it is true that most of what people see is from like-minded sources, the patterns that we find are not consistent with some of the worst fears about echo chambers on social media. And second, as I just mentioned, although some of these changes in the intervention that we ran did have pretty drastic, dramatic effects on people's own platform experience, that did not turn into a change in their political attitude. So this idea of exposing you to the other side, taking you of the echo chamber that has been proposed so frequently, at least in the case of this study, we didn't find it to be a silver bullet that could help reduce political polarization. Before I conclude, one more thing I wanted to add about the papers is that, here we're representing some of the lead authors, but there's a long list of other collaborators, like co-authors in the paper that were involved, as well as a long list of people within Meta in data science, research, legal, partnerships that really spend a lot of time and effort into this project. And they're in a list of acknowledgements in the paper, and I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge them here too. With that, I think we move on to the next paper.
Great, thanks so much. So my name is Neil. I'm going to talk about this paper called Reshares on Social Media Amplify Political News, but do not detectably affect beliefs or opinions. So this is another one of the experimental papers. And just to step back a little bit to see what is we trying to do in these experiments. So the experiments that have been published so far are the like-minded one that Pablo talked about. So what happens when you decrease the amount of like-minded content in someone's feed and take them out of their echo chamber? Jenna's going to talk about one, which is what happens when you change the way things are ranked on someone's newsfeed, right? And you kind of break the algorithm. And the one I'm going to talk about is basically what happens when you don't allow people to see content that's reshared. So there's many other interventions that have not been published yet, not because they're less important, but because they just didn't get through the finish line with these other papers. So these include things like what happens if you don't allow people to see ads, what happens if you don't allow people to see political ads, what happens if you decrease the amount of untrustworthy content they're seeing. And so one way to think about, and there's even one experiment which paid people to not use Facebook at all and totally go cold turkey on it. So what is the goal of this? So one way to think about why we did all these experiments is that we wanted to know, okay, what's the effect of a cold medicine? But a cold medicine has a lot of different things in it. It has a decongestant, it has a pain reliever, it has a bunch of different things. So you can imagine that one experiment you could run is to say, okay, some people are not going to have any cold medicine. And we did that, and that is forthcoming. But the other ones are taking little pieces of the medicine and saying, okay, if I took this little piece away, like the algorithm, what happens? If I take this little piece away, which is the reshares, what happens? So that's the way to kind of look at some of these results. They're taking away small pieces. So you might find the results to be not large on some outcome variables. However, it doesn't mean that if you took away the whole pill or some combination, it wouldn't have those results. So that's just something to keep in mind. So the one I'm going to talk about is what happens when you don't let people see reshared content. And why do we do this? So why is reshared content so interesting? So one reason we did it is because one feature of a lot of viral content is that it is reshared, and that's the mechanism by which content goes viral. A lot of stuff that's reshared doesn't go viral. And moreover, I think there's this idea that organic content production is a different process than the viral spreading of reshared information. And we might have a better social media platform if it was restricted to organic. So other social media platforms have experimented this. So for example, Twitter once, before you retweet it, they said, are you sure you want to retweet this? Or they encourage quote tweeting, which says, okay, don't just retweet it, try to read, engage, and kind of write something organic. And the logic is that when people are writing organic content, they're more thoughtful, they're less likely to just have knee-jerk reactions, and maybe when the retweet function actually makes people kind of spread worse stuff around the internet. So that's kind of the idea of this project. I think one thing to realize about all of these projects is a lot of them are motivated because people in the policy community in the real world say, okay, this piece of content that's bad has feature X. And one thing they don't realize is that there's a lot of good stuff that also has feature X. So when you take away feature X, you're taking away some bad stuff, but you're also taking away a lot of good stuff. And I think reshares have this feature. So there's a lot of bad stuff that gets reshared. A lot of good stuff for democracy gets reshared too, like news. So I encourage you to read the paper. It's very short, it's only 5 pages, but I'm going to highlight kind of what the 2 main results I kind of saw from it was. So one is that the kind of content people see changes a lot when you don't allow reshared content. Specifically, there's a lot less news and there's a lot less political news. And everything that comes along with not seeing news. So there's less partisan news, things like that, less forms of misinformation, but also less forms of information too. That's good. And then what are the consequences? So just like in Pablo's study that he talked about, we didn't find any effects on polarization. We didn't really find that many effects on misinformation, but we did find that people generally There's a little bit of nuance to this, but they generally had less knowledge of the news. Now, maybe this doesn't this doesn't sound like rocket surgery to everybody in this room, which is, okay, when you take away news from people, they have less knowledge about the news and you don't want them to reshare it. But I think it's an important corrective, because I think it shows that actually you lose something a lot when you take away reshares, and you actually don't have much of a trade-off. So there's not this huge increase in polarization, which suggests, I think my prior was updated, that the reshare function is actually an important part of social media, and actually getting rid of it or disabling it or weakening it could actually have negative democratic outcomes and consequences. Okay?
All right. So the last paper that I'll summarize for you is around algorithms and the effects of changing both Facebook and Instagram's default personalized feed ranking algorithm with a simple reversed chronological feed. And just as Neil said, the reason we wanted to do this experiment is because chronological feed has been proposed as a policy solution to preventing or limiting the spread of harmful information. So we had about 23,000 consenting participants on Facebook, 21,000 on Instagram. And for a random subset of them, instead of having their default personalized feed, they would see, whenever they went onto the platforms, the most recent posts from someone in their network, whether it's a friend for Facebook, whether it's a friend, group, or page. Okay, so what happens when we change the algorithm to chronological? First is that we see a huge decline in how much people use Facebook and Instagram. So maybe that's not surprising given what these algorithms are for. It's about 20% less time on Facebook, 11% less time on Instagram. We also see that people are engaging less when they are on the platforms, and we also see some substitution. So for users who are using Instagram on their phones, we see that they're using TikTok and YouTube more. So there's substitution away. In terms of the overall kind of results on political outcomes, this changing of the algorithm really changes what people see when they're on the platform. So they're seeing less like-minded content from less like-minded sources, but they're also seeing less content from cross-cutting sources. So you see a decrease in both, and so that means there's an increase in content from mixed or moderate sources. But I think a little bit counterintuitively, people are actually seeing more political content, both on Facebook and Instagram in the chronological feed. And maybe, I mean, that could be because people are also just seeing more content from pages and groups when they're on Facebook, and kind of potentially less close ties more generally. In terms of polarization, we don't see any effect on issue or affective polarization. We don't see anything on political knowledge. We don't see anything on self-reported political behavior or other key attitudes. So we're measuring these attitudes. We don't see anything. The exception is 2 areas of on-platform behavior. So when we look at political engagement online, so this is things like signing online petitions, mentioning political candidates, we see that that decreases in chronological feed, and we think that decreased political engagement may just be a function of the decreased overall engagement. They're just decreasing less with this chronological feed experience. And the second, though, is that in the chronological feed, we see people clicking more on partisan news sources. So this is action taken by the users. And so you might think, is this contradictory? We saw a decline in views, exposure to like-minded and cross-cutting content, and more mixed and moderate content from mixed and moderate sources. But when we look, this is about specifically engagement with partisan news. And there we see that there's this increased engagement. So we see these kind of behavioral changes online, but across all of the other outcomes in terms of attitudes and self-reported behavior, we don't see any change, even though there's this dramatic change in how much time people are spending on Facebook and Instagram and what they're encountering when we change from the default personalized feed to the reverse chronological feed.
Great, thank you, Jen. Pablo and Neil, that was about the best summary of these papers that you'll probably ever hear. And I really appreciate you all doing that and all the tremendous work that you and your co-authors have done. I'm gonna start our conversation off with 2 kinds of questions. The first is I just wanna address the big, sort of null result across the experiments. And then we'll get into many of the behavioral effects that you all noticed, like the substantial changes in behavior. One of the things that we've been dealing with in other areas of social media is this idea of like what an effect size is and how to think about, you had a huge experiment, it was over 3 months, which is a bigger treatment than almost any other study. And yet we see this very small effect, essentially zero, given the statistical power I have. One of the big questions that people, certainly in the media, have been talking about, and certainly for policy people, is what does this mean for us? So I would love your takes on your assessment of this. It went against your pre-registered hypotheses. You have really excellent power and a diverse and large group of people. So what are your takes on this sort of finding? On polarization anyways.
We can just go in order.
Okay, sure. Well, I wanted, so we are looking at average effects.
Right.
And so that's something really important to keep in mind. And there's some political phenomenon that happens at the tail ends of the distributions that are very important, but that we wouldn't capture, even though we're very well powered to detect relatively even small effects. Because you could have mobilization by a few thousand people that's extremely disruptive, but that wouldn't show up when we're looking at these averages. I also think it says something about the fact that maybe a lot of the challenges we encounter with social media is happening at the ends of the distributions. And I think in the research that we're doing, that is borne out by the effects that we have when we look at the averages.
I will, let me be a little bit controversial on that, because while that is true, I think one of the advantages of their study is that we spend a lot of time thinking about power and being able to detect effect sizes also for subpopulations, and we also spend a lot of time working on the methodology for heterogeneous treatment effects. And one of the things that is pretty remarkable about these studies is that when we split by some of these subgroups, people that are more exposed to like-minded sources or less, levels of digital literacy, strength of partisanship, these null results are robust across all these subsets. Although I think that is true that some all of these subsets might be too small for us to be able to capture that. So I think that's interesting because in the context of existing research, I think we're pretty well powered, and the fact that we found those null effects, I think that's informative. With that said, I mean, of course, these are 3-month interventions in the context of an election. It does not generalize to other contexts. So I think it's important to put that in context. But the last thing I will say is I mean, prior to working at Meta, I was an academic, and I was very familiar with this literature on the political effects of social media. And I would say the results here are generally consistent with what has been found before. I'm just thinking, for example, the deactivation study that Matt Gensko and others published in AER a couple of years ago. They did find that deactivating Facebook had a significant effect on polarization, but it was very specific measure of polarization that was based on positions on issues something related to news. Affective polarization, it was a no effect there. We've run our own deactivation. We cannot discuss the results yet, but the results in these studies are consistent with that result in that deactivation study.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add a couple of things. So one is that when you do these experiments, we could only do them in 2020. It's not like we had a time machine to go back to do them in 2016 or something like that. So there's two separate questions. One is our current state of polarization or whatever your level is due to social media in the past? That's not what these studies can answer, but they can theoretically get at mechanisms, and they can kind of ask the policy questions that if you change these features, what would the effect be? And I think the clear answer is it's not a silver bullet. And I think the nice thing about all these data is that Pablo is right, is that it's very consistent with prior research, but it also gives some nuance. And part of the nuance is what actually changes when you change these features. And things change in kind of more complicated ways than you'd expect. So let's look at the chrono feed for an example. So if you switch to chrono feed, your inventory has to be filled with something, right? It's not like it's just disappeared or something. And I think what you did find was that groups and pages kind of get privileged once you put the chrono feed. Well, guess what? One thing we know about Facebook is that a lot of the bad people are the groups and pages. And a lot of the good people are people, right? People are actually generally good and nice, and sometimes it's these groups and pages. So this kind of thing, which is, let's just change the algorithm, well, that can actually change it for the worse in some dimensions, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. And I think these are very complex systems. So Pablo's right that we could detect heterogeneous treatment effects, but one thing is harder to detect is when you make one blunt change, lots of complex stuff goes on in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and just another example of that for chronological feed, which I didn't mention, is in chronological feed. So people generally about a very low percentage of views is untrustworthy content or content from untrustworthy sources and incivil content. But when you switch to chronological feed, it's about 3% for both, okay? When you switch to chronological feed, the proportion of content from untrustworthy sources doubles on Facebook, but then the proportion of incivil content goes down. So you have different things, different categories of potentially harmful or things that are changing in different ways. And at the kind of what we're measuring at the end is people's attitudes and their self-reported behavior, which might be the result of the mixture of all these different factors.
I want to follow up on a couple of the things you brought up because there are my questions for around these more behavioral effects. Does content moderation sort of like get highlighted here? So Jen, just to your point there, you see a feature change that then leads to more untrustworthy content but less uncivil. And so there's a feature operation that's taking place and it's sort of independent of the content you're going to be fed, but it end up having an effect on it. So do we need to be thinking about content moderation differently? And do you have any plans as part of the larger sphere of studies to look at content moderation?
So there is, as Neil mentioned, there's another paper that's looking at experimentally what happens if you demote content from untrustworthy sources. And we're using, so when we say untrustworthy, we're saying content from untrustworthy sources. So these are producers of information that have spread misinformation in the past, but that doesn't mean every piece of content that they're disseminating is misinformation. So there's an experiment looking at that. And there's also, I'm working on a paper with Youngmi, who will be looking at effects of, or the prevalence of coordinated and authentic behavior. So there's more. I don't know that any of the papers are looking at content moderation per se, but we are looking at a lot of the topics related.
It's true. It does speak to, actually, we have a co-author, Hunt Alcott, and this is I'm going to be honest, like, I think one of my concerns with this group of projects is that Hunt Alcott has written about something called site selection bias. So it's like, who are willing to be your industry partners? And it's just that, like, the company that was our industry partner is one of the most responsible company with some of the most talented moderators, and that did a lot of reforms. This is sort of like when studies show that, like, police departments behave very well, but it's like the police departments that are already behaving well are the ones that share the data with the academics. So it's like in 2020, we're basically analyzing a robust, well-executed content moderation platform, but that's the site we were allowed to study. That doesn't mean, for example, that, like, if we did this on modern Twitter, like these experiments, we'd find the same things. And it's a site selection problem because there's no way that modern current Twitter would allow academics to do this on their current platform where there's much less moderation.
Agreed. Okay, excellent, good. Okay, and I want to follow up on another piece here, this notion of heterogeneity that Jen mentioned and Pablo discussed there. One of my students, Angelique, has been working across a couple of different domains of kind of harmful, toxic content, misinformation, toxic, uncivil. Finding something similar to what Jen was saying, which is that very few people produce most of it, and very few people are exposed or consume it. Your sense, Jen, was that that's also taking place here, but is it the case that in your studies, I know you had so much supplementary material, it's massive. Did you find any, like, were you able to detect any heterogeneity like that, where you're seeing a small percentages like accounting for a ton of the harm?
I think in segregation, for example, one of the cuts by which we look at the data is looking at the top 1% most engaged users in terms of, like, engaging with political news on Facebook, and that's exactly what we found. Like, these users are the ones that are, like, producing the most content, are, like, the most segregated as well, like driving a lot of, like, the overall patterns that we observe. In fact, like, initially we pre-registered, like, we were going to look at, we're going to have, like, 80%, 20%, like 1% of, like, the different, like, percentages of the distribution. We had to deviate from that because the 20% included people that were not politically engaged at all. So we, like, ended up just looking at the top 10% and then top 1%. So that definitely aligns with that. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's been a difficulty for narratives in talking about social media, where we tend to speak across like a uniform distribution of behavior, like everybody behaves sort of the same, but in fact, there's a lot of this
Yeah.
behavior tends to be. Okay, one other question that I'll open up to the floor. This is a selfish one. We've been looking a lot at untrustworthy information. Looking across the studies, especially the observational one, it looked like there was relatively little exposure to untrustworthy websites. Is that your sort of like understanding of the data looking across as well, especially during this period where we have an election that was quite fraught and had high levels of misinformation after the fact?
Well, I mean, just the percentages that I was sharing. So on Facebook, like 2.6% of average users' feeds contain content from untrustworthy sources. That doubles when you change the chronological feed. That's actually reduced when we withhold the reshares. So this is where reshares and the feed chronological feed goes in different directions. But so yeah, that seems like 3% is not a particularly high proportion of users' feed content that's coming from these sources. And again, so not saying it's not a classification of all the content, it's just of the source.
Right, and I just wanted to clarify, that's 3% of people that were exposed like once to misinformation?
No,
Or
no,
is
no,
that
the
3% of their content?
feeds, average 3% of the content they're exposed to in their feeds, yeah.
Yeah, I think like one challenge when answering this sort of questions, like there's like, significant measurement challenges with like measuring like, what is misinformation, what is untrustworthy sources. In these studies, we look at two subsets, so it's like we take two approaches and both are imperfect. One is looking at, third-party fact checkers ratings and looking at content that has been rated or matched to something that has been rated. But of course, the coverage of what can be fact-checked is not at all like the entire universe of what is misinformation. The other approach is like this like broader sense, like untrustworthy sources, which is looking at, in these studies, we look at pages or groups that have shared misinformation at least twice in the entire lifetime. But of course, that doesn't mean that everything else that they're sharing is misinformation. So the truth is somewhere in between, but it's very hard to answer. And of course, there's like broader conceptual questions about, how do you come up with like ground truth when it comes to measuring misinformation?
Right, major challenge.
Yeah.
And using that perspective, it's probably the case that there was even less exposure in their feeds to misinformation, because presumably a regular misinformation producer isn't always producing misinformation. So it's just coming from them is about that 3%.
I mean, the survey also asked people quiz questions to assess their levels of misinformation, and generally across the treatments we published so far, there was not effects on the quiz questions,
So-
which was a more direct way to get the people actually internalize misinformation, not just get exposed to it.
I see. So when they're exposed, could you give us an example of some of the quiz stuff, like if they're exposed versus like their beliefs, I guess, around?
So I think like there were like different types of items. Some of them were like true or false, did this happen, did this not happen? And I think like in real time, as like, Neil, you were like deeply involved in that. We were looking at like the content that was like misinformation popular during the election, and like asking participants specifically about like statements related to those stories that were circulating.
And so their exposure was unrelated to their ability to answer those questions, their accuracy.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, but again, there will be one new paper in the future that like focuses specifically on like misinformation. So there will be more evidence on this in the future.
Great, very
Yeah.
exciting. We'll open up to the room. As we do that and get our microphones going around, just a quick clarification question from online. Could you repeat how uncivil was defined by the researchers?
Incivility comes from a text-based classifier that we adapted specifically for these studies. And essentially, content that is, offensive, disparaging, this sort of thing. So it was like looking at like insults or things like that. And in the long appendix to the papers, there's like a more precise definition. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Pavel. All right, first question. Thanks.
So I just want to press on what the facts are here, the same thing that Jeff was asking, because I maybe missed. 3% of the average person's feed is coming from untrustworthy sources? That seems like a lot, actually, to me. And the second, which surprised me, was that Pablo said that 7% of the average person's feed is something like news.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe things have changed since 2020, but I thought it was the average person was like half that it was closer to 3 to 5% as a general. And so first of all, am I hearing you correctly here? And second, I mean, Pablo, obviously you're there, so you know what's happening under the hood. How, do you feel confident that the people who opted into the study are representative of the larger Facebook population?
Just the first question, so for the default algorithmic feed, so that's the control group.
Yeah.
2.6%, so average share of users' feeds that contain content from untrustworthy sources is 2.6%. So
And
that's,
how then there's a tail question. Are there some people where it's 90% and then or is that pretty standard that you think that it's about the average person has about that much?
yeah, we would have to
Yeah.
look at the appendix to see what the standard deviation
Yeah.
is for that, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I feel like that's what we find in the study. I mean, it's true, like, so our sample is biased in some ways. So for example, it's like more active than the average like monthly active user because of like the way we recruited people. People that were more active were more likely to self-select into the study. They were more politically interested, things like that. So in the papers, we try to address this by using weights. But of course, weights only take you there. We have a large sample, so in general, we're fine, but yeah.
It is true that several magnitudes larger than, say, Jennifer Allen and Duncan Watts' estimates of about 0.1 or so, 0.01. So. Next question, up here, Congressman.
Thanks. It's an incredibly broad and important study. I'm coming from a practitioner standpoint of having been part of more political campaigns than I would like to admit. And partly to Neil's point, I guess it's part observation, part question. It feels like in some ways the conclusion here is social media driving polarization than does 3 months of a revision of an algorithm on a single platform solve polarization. And those are very different frames, and they're still important, but it does seem like any effort to draw this into questions about social media's impact on depolarization miss all these larger effects that you all acknowledge. So framing it that way, and as I said, more, is it fair to suggest that reframing? And just, some aspects that where there's no putting the genie back in the bottle on, but the lack of political journalists and journalism and coverage, particularly at the local level, mainstream media using more and more extreme headlines for their clickbaits to try to stay in business. So there's knock-on effects, people I think sharing content that from the other side of the view almost to stoke their own feeds. So that's kind of my, coming out as a practitioner, that's what it feels like we learned from the study. So I want to know if I'm being too narrow in that conclusion. And then a methodological question, which is two quick methodological questions. One is, where do like memes and jokes fall in this? Is that considered a news source? How did that play into the studies? And then on your point, Neil, about saying there was a negative effect, which is people were less engaged there. Are we able to control for, I know you mentioned going to TikTok, but if people are then engaging democratically offline or in some other way, and would you be able to build that in as potentially net positive in the study? So just curious about whether we know whether people are engaging civically in other ways, but thank you very much.
Well, I can just very quickly, and then you guys take the other ones. Yeah, so there was a even smaller group of self-selected people who agreed to have their online browsers tracked. So we can see what other websites they're going to and things like that. And the kernel was a little bit different, but at least in the reshared study, there was a little bit less effect on people not engaging with the platform, but they didn't like go to the other things online. Now the question is, what about offline? Well, we don't have a camera that they agreed to be consented and following and see what the spillovers are. But we do have, I think, the self-report data, and it wasn't pre-registered, but we didn't find any effects on participation, self-reported, like vote choice, going to rallies, or anything like that, that you guys can handle the other one.
Yeah, on the question of like the memes and jokes, so one of the decisions that the academic team made early on is that in some cases we would use internal meta classifiers to identify content. It has like drawbacks and there's like less transparency, but like it was like quicker to use it. And one of the other advantages is that it would have coverage on like image and video content as well. So as long as some of these memes and jokes were political in nature, they would be included in whenever we talk about like politics, exposure to politics, they would be covered there as well.
Maybe to the broader question. So I think you're right that we live in a world with social media. We can't get the counterfactual of if social media had not emerged decades ago, what would political polarization look like? And so I think what we're trying to do in these studies is look at policy interventions that have been proposed and see what are the effects. And now I think in retrospect we can say 3 months, that seems really short, but it was 3 months during a contentious election period. And we don't, and that's the empirical data we have. And I think to date, this is probably the most extensive empirical data we have around these questions. But I think it definitely speaks to the need for kind of more types of this research on more platforms, building on Neil's point, and potentially across platforms so we can better understand the overall system. Because people are using social media all the time, most people are not only using one.
And I'd also just add, like, kind of also who the population is. So right now, the goal was, let's look at the typical Facebook user in the country. And this is someone who's like not super political, who doesn't follow politics that closely, is really posting about cats and weddings and all that kind of stuff. However, there's a lot of indirect effects in politics. So this is just my conjecture, but it's very possible that social media has had very little effect on normal people, but has greatly affected the political elite class and their levels of polarization and how they see the world. And I think a raw reason why academics are worried a lot about social media is that they are part of the political elite class. And they're kind of viewing it through their lens. Now that's not to say it doesn't matter, because if the political elite class is becoming polarized because of social media, that can still affect democratic outcomes. But this study was looking, what is the direct effect on a typical user? So maybe follow-up studies have to be a little bit more nuanced in what are the indirect effects, not just what the direct effects are.
Or we should treat the political class. Let's have the politicians have a chrono feed. I'd like to see that. One question from online, and then we'll go to this next one in the back. This is related, I think, to what you're getting at, Neil, but this is from Ravi Iyer online, and he's asking about, publishers and politicians are talking about the need to do this more polarizing content, because they think that's how they're going to get attention and get shares. And so, Jen, I think it goes back to your observation with the chrono feed, where it's not just the algorithms and people passively accepting them, they're actually making choices and engaging with things they want. So when they're getting chrono, they're going to go out and find that political information more. So how would you respond, or what's a thought here for Ravi and people that are thinking about this ecosystem is so much bigger? The algorithm alone isn't enough, I think, along what Neil was saying.
I think I would say, yeah.
I mean, that's a fair point. I think like it's something like we acknowledge in the paper that we're essentially just looking at partial equilibrium effects. We cannot examine the effects on like, the supply side of like how like people would change. Like publishers, if this were to like launch everywhere, of course it would change like incentives. Like if there would be incentive to like publish as much content as possible, because then like recency is like privilege as opposed to relevance. So yeah, that's something that unfortunately we cannot answer with this design, and that's also something that's like very, very difficult to answer. But I think like in the paper we're like trying to be careful about exactly what we can say and what we can't.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name is Heikki. I'm a visiting fellow here, and I come from a policy side on the EU previously. My questions are related to the vectors of disinformation. If you could speak a little bit to foreign versus domestic disinformation, how that affects also the language regimes that the disinformation that you're looking at, and then finally, with a view to maybe also future elections, the rise of synthetic media and the audio and video that we can expect in the future playing out also in the political space. Thank you.
So I mentioned this before earlier. So Youngmi and actually Ruth Apple are both academic lead authors, along with me, on a paper looking at coordinated and authentic behavior in the 2020 election. And that paper will more specifically focus on both US-based and foreign-based efforts to spread mis and disinformation. So that is a paper we're working on. Hopefully we'll be able to share the results soon.
The last part was about the rise of synthetic media. Do you have any sense from the data you observed here, what we might want to think about or expect?
So we have one other paper where we slightly touch on this. It just back in 2020, I feel like this wasn't like as concerned as it is today. There's one paper where we that is completed but under review. That studies the spread of misinformation, through research cascades, and we split by different types of misinformation. One of the categories that we look at, which is available to third-party fact checkers, is altered media, but yeah, so we'll have more to say, but I think like back in 2020, my sense is like it wasn't as big of a concern as it might be in 2024.
And I would say just more generally, to kind of reiterate Neil's point from earlier, we did this in 2020. 2020 elections, everyone was very aware because of what happened in 2016. So it could be that in 2024, because we didn't see as much turmoil in 2020 in the same way as 2016, platform policies may change. And so we may see something different again in the upcoming election. So I think this is this is what we know based on these set of studies, but I think we should, hopefully we'll have opportunities to continue doing research going forward.
So, hi, Jaran Budak from University of Michigan, also at Caspis here for the year. I'm a big fan of all of these works. Thank you for them. My question was building on the point that Jen was making, and I think Jeff was also commenting on, that this sort of these distributional aspects and the fact that a lot of this bad stuff is coming from tails of the distribution. So I'm curious if you have any papers in the pipeline that are particularly focused on these populations and focus perhaps on, so we have a lot of focus on how social media is changing average people's, attitudes and opinions, and you're sort of showing that not really. But I guess the other aspect is social media's ability to connect people with each other and basically finding these sort of extreme groups, allowing extreme groups to connect to one another and information alike. So I'm curious if there's anything in the pipeline. If not, I can see reasons why it would be really challenging to do that, but I would be curious, if not, if you can share what you think are the challenges for carrying such research.
So in this paper that we look at untrustworthy sources and misinformation, one of the things we did was at the sampling stage, we oversampled users that were much more likely to be in the top percentiles of exposure to untrustworthy sources, like sources that repeatedly share misinformation, precisely for this reason, because otherwise we were worried that we wouldn't have enough people to. So that I think will help us understand that. I think the other paper in segregation, one of the interesting findings that I think is related to your second point about groups, is that we found groups are groups and pages are compared to regular people sharing political news, contribute much more to high levels of ideological segregation. Which in that paper we cannot get much deeper than that, but I think this is consistent with the hypothesis that you were mentioning.
I think also this question of, okay, does the average effect matter? Does some sort of effect in the tail matter? It kind of depends on the research question and your theory of how a democracy works. So I would say most political scientists would be well, the reason we care about these average effects is because democracies are majoritarian institutions, and the marginal voter is what influences outcomes and everything like that. That's a traditional way of viewing it, and it's why seeing overall effects of polarization in the electorate kind of matter. But but that's an American politics kind of perspective. But what does it take to threaten a democracy? On January 6th, there's 100 people that did, or however many it was, did something really bad. And a lot of people would say, oh, well, Facebook or whatever social media helped create these networks, it created this extremism. And that's these are people who are not participating in the electoral process of legitimately dealing in a democracy. So I think that's an open question. If you have fringe groups that are participating in political violence, in that kind of stuff, maybe the tails matter. On the other hand, if you're focused more on the normal processes of elections, then being obsessed with what's going on in the tails matters less. I think it depends on how you view the world.
Hello. Two-part question. So first part is, so your control group for most of these experiments was sort of the regular Facebook feed. But during the 3 months leading up to the US 2020 election, the regular Facebook feed wasn't the regular Facebook feed. There were over 70 break glass measures that were implemented that really changed the nature of the feed. So I'm just curious, so the first part of the question is, how does that impact the interpretation of your results, given that the Facebook feed and the regular Facebook feed in the 3 months leading up to the election wasn't really the normal Facebook feed that you get the rest of the year? And then the second part of the question is related to that. What do you think it'll take to be able to do follow-up studies like this again, especially other times of year, longer duration, or especially outside of the U.S. in other countries in their electoral context?
I'll take the second one first, as like the only meta person here. I don't call the shots on that decision of whether there will be follow-up studies or not, but one thing I want to say is like, we've learned a lot through this project about like how to manage a collaboration like this, of like, I think like, you know, what are the things that scale, what are the things that don't. So I think there are a lot of lessons for the company, and not only for Meta, but hopefully other companies as well in the future can do studies like this.
Well, on the first question, just to be clarifying, so when we talk about an intervention, that's essentially saying what is the marginal effect of that intervention, not the overall average effect of those types of interventions. So what does that mean like in practice? So for example, let's say you're looking at advertising. Like what's the effect of getting like an advertisement for Coke on your drinking behavior? And, but like there's a regular world out there in the control group, right, that the researcher is not implementing. People are seeing Coke advertisements in print, they're seeing it on billboards, they're seeing Coke vending machines, etc. So the effect of our one Coke ad would be the marginal effect, which might be smaller than the average effect of being exposed to Coke, right? So that's an issue with almost every randomized controlled trial. So what do people do in response to that? Well, they can, for example, engage in like structural modeling. That's a way to get at average effects. And one thing I hope, and I think when this data becomes public, is that economists will actually do some structural estimation of those to help get at some of those questions, knowing that the control group has a bunch of stuff going on and that these are marginal effects on top of that.
Okay, so we wait for our next in-house one. We have a nice, more on the softball side of things. Konstantina Yaniva is asking about what questions you're excited about next, either ones that are coming out in the future studies or that you're doing in your own research.
So as I mentioned, we're working on this paper looking at coordinated and authentic behavior, and I think to some of the earlier questions, this is looking much more at the tail ends of the distribution, because we're looking specifically at this type of coordinated deception and where it's coming from, how many people is it reaching on Facebook and Instagram, what might be the consequences of that.
What are you excited about, Pablo?
So I think like this study, so in the literature on like misinformation, there's like this debate open about like, does misinformation spread faster and deeper than the truth, right? And there's like different studies showing different things. And one of the papers that I mentioned that we're working on is like, we'll examine that in the context of Facebook in the 2020 election. And I'm excited about the paper, both like substantively, but also methodologically. We do a lot of, you know, cool, exciting things about like research cascades and stuff like that. So I'm really hoping that we can share that soon.
So one unpublished paper that I think will be interesting is we're doing one on how people sever and create friendships that are across political lines. And I've done stuff like this in the past using like online dating data, and Facebook data is just like a really great data set to look at how politics is affecting people's social interactions and how they respond to events like January 6th or the election on their social relationships.
Great, and we've been focused, oh, we have a question there.
Okay, hi, I just want to follow up on what Pablo mentioned earlier. So it seems clear to me that these papers kind of establish a new gold standard for how empirical research should be done in this space. So I would just love to hear more about kind of some of the experiences, challenges, or lessons learned from this kind of collaboration, and also whether this is kind of a one-off election project or kind of the starting shot for a beautiful golden age of industry-academia collaboration.
So lessons learned, I mean, so there are a few things I think like worked really well and contributed to the success of this project. So like we designed like a system of code review. So all the analysis code had to be, anything that was like written by someone on the meta side had to be reviewed by an academic, and the other way around. And I think like that worked very well in terms of like helping us make progress. Pre-registration, I think like for all the projects, like that's definitely something very nice to, that we did and I'm like proud of. And then some of the things I think like are, you know, buried in the appendix of the papers, but we spent a lot of time thinking about, you know, how to design the studies. Like we came up with like very different proposals of like the samples that we would analyze and like how many waves and things like that. So that's something that, I don't know, in the future I hope that we can also write like a more methodological piece. like addressing, like sharing some of the lessons along these lines.
Yeah, I mean, I am a bit personally worried that this is a one-off, that it's hard to replicate, and you have to have potentially a theory of corporations. So one theory of corporations is that you actually have to be in this sweet spot where you're a professional company that's really unpopular. And those like sometimes don't align. So what made Facebook very special at the time when the company was being run? So it was this large, powerful, really well-run company that people hated, right? And so they're like, okay, like how do we forestall future regulation? Maybe like this project is a good way to do that. Now Facebook is the hero. They're a beloved company, and Elon is the evil guy, right? And so now they have less incentive to do something like this because it may not have the same corporate returns. So I mean, my belief is that these are for-profit companies. So the number one way to analyze their behavior is what is going to maximize their shareholders' value. That is how they think of it, and that is how they should think of it, frankly. But if you're like a policymaker or an academic, relying on shareholder value to be the main way that academic research gets done has a lot of limitations. So right now, a lot of the most companies in the worst shape are the ones that would be least likely to collaborate with academics.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Working on this project, Meta had to put in a lot of time and resources in order to make this research happen. And it's very hard for me to imagine other companies wanting to invest that unless those perfect kind of storm of conditions are in place. So then I think the open question is, from a kind of public good perspective, how valuable is it to have this type of research and continuing to have this type of research? What then are the other mechanisms that could incentivize companies to produce this types of research, whether it's from government or from other entities? But I think from pure shareholder value alone, it seems very unlikely that companies would invest the resources and time needed to do this type of work, collaborative work again.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate all the huge effort, but also you taking the time to speak to us about the research aspects and what the policy implications are. In November, we'll have some of their collaborators, Josh Tucker and Talia Stroud, come and talk a little bit more about the public relations and the collaboration level issues that we just touched on here. So please join me in thanking our panelists, first of all. And next week we have Jeannie Tsai, one of our colleagues here in the psychology department, and she's one of the world's leading experts on affect or emotion across cultures, and she's done some really fantastic work about the way we think about how, what goes viral here in the US, so things that have really high negative arousal, are quite different in other countries like Japan, in which there's very different affective dynamics. So please join us then, and thanks once again, everybody.